ordeal is over, and they're free.
A big win for the Biden administration, for the American people, and for the rule of law.
The likely re-election of Donald Trump, I think, caused these guys to get released.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland, CBS News in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. 3 Americans and a permanent resident are on their way home tonight after the U.S. secured their release from prison in Russia. The moment 4 American prisoners were freed from jail was captured by Russian media. The deal includes Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was sentenced to 16 years on espionage charges just 2 weeks ago. U.S. Marine veteran Paul Whelan, who's been in prison for nearly 6 years, Russian-American journalist Alsu Komasheva, and U.S. resident Vladimir Karamurza.
It's an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's a relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time.
Olivia Gazis has been on top of this story for us. Olivia, the swap includes 24 people with several different countries involved. How did it all come together?
Absolutely, Scott. Well, American officials have been describing this swap as the most complex in modern history, certainly the most complex and complicated in U.S., Russia, and even U.S. Soviet history, which is notable given how many spy swaps were done during the Cold War and thereafter. And that is because, as you say, there were more than 6 countries involved, 24 prisoners. And the types of prisoners, these were not just spies. These were political prisoners that the Russians were free to handle more capriciously. And we've since learned about some of the intense diplomacy that was spearheaded mainly by the White House and the State Department to convince other Western allies, including, crucially, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Germany, which was the linchpin, who were holding people of interest to the Russians in order to sort of sweeten the deal and facilitate the swap. You also had to enlist Turkey as a sort of neutral territory for it all to take place. And that's in addition to the multiple agencies that had to deal with different parts of all of these governments in order to take everything over the finish line.
So when you have multiple agencies doing some big thing, it often gets pretty thorny. Who handled the negotiations here on our end?
Sure. Well, the White House and the State Department principally handled the outreach to the friendly countries, the Western nations that were holding prisoners of interest to Russia. We have since learned that the State Department Secretary Blinken tried to convince the Russians to deal in diplomatic channels so as not to give credence to these baseless accusations the U.S. maintained that Paul and Evan were engaged in any sort of espionage. The Russians rejected that. They said, no, we caught Evan red-handed, for example, Lavrov told Blinken, and we want to deal in what they refer to as the special channel, the intelligence channel, which the CIA has run in the past and ran this time around. So instead, you had CIA Director William Burns dealing directly with his intelligence counterparts in Russia, the FSB and the SVR, the heads of those organizations. We know that he made a crucial phone call to arrive at a deal in principle in early July, and that the special channel, the senior CIA officials and Russian officials who thereafter sort of finalized the deal would meet in a third country in order to negotiate and for the U.S. negotiators to put down their position.
When he spoke early this afternoon about the prisoner swap, the president talked about the importance of allies to achieving this exchange. Take a listen.
So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world.
From your reporting, Olivia, how does this fit into the president's approach to getting wrongfully detained Americans released?
Sure. Well, it's very important, of course, as the president said, to have friends who will do you favors. And these are big favors, right? These are countries that have put resources towards capturing, prosecuting, and convicting, imprisoning Russian nationals from a foreign country. It's happened before. In the case of Trevor Reed, who was traded for Konstantin Yoroshenko, a Russian pilot, we got him from Liberia. In the case of Brittany Griner, we traded Victor Boot, who came to us from Thailand, a convicted arms dealer. So those were not trades that the U.S. could make itself. It had to call in those favors. But it can, over time, if you ask a favor too much, disincentivize these countries who are, again, going to costs to capture these nationals only to have them handed over to the U.S. and ultimately handed over back to the Russians. So while it's good to have friends who will do you favors, it's important not to ask those favors too much.
All right, Olivia Gazis, great work. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
President Biden and Vice President Harris will greet the Americans freed from Russia tonight. The likely Democratic nominees celebrated this swap, speaking earlier today.
We never stopped fighting for their release. And today, in spite of all of their suffering, it gives me great comfort to know that their horrible ordeal is finally over.
Let's bring in Robert Costa and Ed O'Keefe join us now. Break down what happened today. Another historic day. Ed, what's the political significance to the vice president of all this?
It was notable that the White House went out of its way to point out that she did play at least a bit part in these negotiations. Attending the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, spoke with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was a guy that needed to be really convinced in person by the president and apparently again by the vice president in the spring. Obviously, that was designed to not only demonstrate that she, too, was involved, but to burnish her foreign policy credentials at a time that a lot of voters are starting to wonder, well, could she do this? Could she pull something like this off? And clearly, today was designed to demonstrate, at least from the White House's perspective and her team's perspective, that she could.
No surprise, no shortage of immediate reaction from lots of folks, including J.D. Vance, while campaigning in Arizona. Let's listen to what he said, then I'll ask you a question after.
I think it's great to have Evan and Paul back in our country. And I think importantly, there's a real sense that the world leaders are afraid that if Donald Trump comes in, they're going to have to start behaving again. And so I really think that this is a response to the likelihood that Donald Trump will be reelected.
Bobby's saying it's in part because of the likelihood Donald Trump will be elected. Donald Trump, meanwhile, on social media, blasted the deal. What do you make of the contrast or the symmetry between those two statements?
Well, for the Trump-Vance campaign, this is a day to endure and carry on. This is a day where the incumbent president, President Biden and Vice President Harris, are so clearly in the spotlight. This is an administrative effort to secure the release of these hostages. They can argue about the political capital on the foreign stage of former President Trump and what might happen should he win the White House again. And this goes to their argument that they will have a stronger foreign policy if he wins the White House again. Trump's notably not an interventionist on foreign policy. It's more about the projection of strength, and they continue, as they did in Harrisburg last night. I was covering Trump's rally there, like to cast the Biden administration as weak. But so far, this is not an election where foreign policy is playing a huge role. But as you say, every day seems to be historic. Something could happen tomorrow on foreign policy. And this is more of a legacy achievement for President Biden, just weeks after he made his decision to leave the Democratic race. This is part of someone who was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, bolstering his case for history that he was always engaged on foreign policy from his days in the Senate until now. In
fact, on that point, two things stuck out when we were in the room today for this event. First, he stuck around and took several questions designed to speak to how this is a legacy burnishing day. In a campaign mode, he might not have done so. Would have been a little more cautious, as the vice president was when she left Houston. But making clear, look, family is my beginning, my middle, my end. And I was trying to get these families reunited, these poor Americans who've been waiting hundreds of days for their families to get back. The other telling part of this, when we were leaving the event, going back to the press pen, if you will, senior administration official I saw said, "How you doing?" He goes, "Did you guys notice that detail in all this about how the president made a call to one of his counterparts just an hour before he announced to the world he wasn't running again, while everyone was questioning whether or not he could actually be president? You guys going to mention that tonight, that he actually can do the job, even though people, including you guys in the press, are raising doubts?" And it shows you they got a bit of a chip on their shoulder right now over there, as they're quite proud of today, but also realize they don't get to do this much longer.
Well, Ed keeps winning here at CBS News with the Rehoboth Beach assignment. There was a lot happening in Rehoboth Beach during that final weekend when he's making this decision. We keep learning more. Yeah. It's going to be a day in history, just like March 31st, 1968, when LBJ stepped away. He was doing so much in Rehoboth Beach, in this beach house. Not the center of the world, with all respect, a beautiful place, but certainly a place now where much was going down.
Only be winning if we could actually go to the beach and not be working by the beach.
So close, yet so far away. It's a big campaign day for the vice president, too. Today, explain why.
Well, she was in Texas wrapping up this visit to see Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee spoke at her funeral, notably flanked by the Clintons, by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and several other black political leaders. One of the first chances to see her as sort of the star of an event, although she made clear it was the Congresswoman who was the star of that event. But beyond that, we know the vetting process continues. At least 6 men now in the mix, 4 governors, a cabinet secretary, a senator, and probably others who haven't necessarily been revealed because we've been told the Harris team is telling them, lie low, don't necessarily be out there taking questions.
The lack of visibility is a sign we're close to something.
Yeah. And look, she has essentially till next Tuesday, Wednesday to do this. So it's a really truncated timeline. It's risk prone because normally this is something that takes months, right? Or at least several more weeks. And she's really only had about 2 weeks to make a decision.
And it's notable that the UAW got behind Vice President Harris before she makes her pick. In case there's any grumbles on the labor side after the pick, well, the endorsement's already been made. And just a note about Sheila Jackson-Lee. We covered her on Capitol Hill. You know, we'll miss Sheila Jackson-Lee, whether you like her politics or didn't like her politics. She was a presence. She was always accessible to reporters. She had a strong personality. She was someone you couldn't help but talk to if you saw her in the hallways. And rest in peace, Congresswoman.
They could rename the House floor after Sheila Jackson-Lee. There was no stronger presence or more reliable presence speaking on the floor than Congresswoman Lee. Thank you both. Lots to do today, more to come. Ed O'Keefe and Robert Costa, appreciate you. Congressman French Hill is co-chair of the Congressional Task Force on American Hostages and Americans Wrongly Detained Abroad. He'll join us this hour with his reaction. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are reacting to today's prisoner swap with Russia.
This looks like a very good deal for the United States and democracy all over the world. Obviously, the priority has to be getting Americans out.
I don't know what we had to give up. I haven't seen the final reports yet, but I do know what we got, and I'm just very, very pleased.
Arkansas Republican Congressman French Hill joins us now, has uniquely closely tracked this issue, co-chair of the Congressional Task Force on American Hostages and Americans Wrongfully Detained Abroad. Congressman, we're grateful for the time. What do you make of the swap and how it all seemed to come together?
Well, Scott, it's good to be with you tonight. Of course, this is a happy day in America because this is a day that families have dreamed to hear some positive news about their loved ones that have been wrongfully detained by the Putin regime in Russia. So it's a happy day. This is a big, complex prisoner swap involving some 6 countries and 24 people, probably the largest since the end of the Cold War. So it's a big deal, and it's a great deal for the families who have been worried to death about the outcome of their family members.
You say it's a big and complex deal. It certainly looks that way. Does this type of deal have to be big and complex to work? Is this kind of how it has to go?
Well, look, what I've always been concerned about is where we've seen America put a price on blue passports by paying money to rogue regimes to return Americans wrongfully detained abroad. We have some 50 American families that are hoping that their American family member comes home. So when we see these complex prisoner swaps, there's always give and take. But here it appeared to me to be a good diplomacy on the part of our negotiators in the United States to let Russia have some people that they're seeking out of incarceration, both here and in Germany and other countries, as well as bring home these members. Paul Whelan's family has been missing him since he went to a wedding in Moscow some 6 years ago. So it is, I think, a good news story tonight. And Haley Stevens, my co-chair on the task force here in the House for those Americans held abroad wrongfully, we're pleased and proud that this has happened, and we are continuing to advocate for those families, both here in Congress and with countries around the world, to bring them home.
What concerns do you have about the Russians who were released in this deal?
Well, look, Russians held in Germany, particularly this one that's being released by Germany, these are bad actors. These are the worst sort of criminals, and that is typical in prisoner swaps. And you've seen that actually in Gaza as some hostages have been released in return for some Palestinians. That's the nature of the business. It's a dirty business. And it's why Americans should be very cautious about traveling to countries where there are bad actors or people trying to obtain American passports to be held hostage. for money or for the release of a criminal. So I have concerns about it, but that's the nature of this business. As I say, it's a dirty business, but we don't want to leave Americans wrongfully detained, incarcerated, tried in prison abroad when we can work collaboratively through our diplomats to bring them home.
About your characterization of this being a dirty business, we've heard that from multiple people today. Former President Trump argued on social media the U.S. should give nothing to get Americans released. Do you agree with him? Is that feasible?
Look, I understand that point of view. That's how all of us feel, because we're outraged when a blue passport holder is taken by a terror group, a state actor, or a thug like Vladimir Putin. So we all reject that. But sometimes in diplomacy, you have to be realistic. To bring our Americans home, we have to do a prisoner exchange. And unfortunately, that's the case here. But let's rejoice that these 3 citizens and a green card holder are back, going to be reunited with their family members. And remember that that's the important thing.
About the other Americans still being held abroad, including the journalist Austin Tice in Syria, does this type of swap make it more likely that happens, that Tice is released, or does it mean it's going to be quite a bit of time until there are future releases?
Conversations happen every day between our diplomats, our special envoy for hostage affairs. You may recall former New Mexico governor and cabinet member Bill Richardson was quite involved in this as someone in the non-governmental organization sector. These conversations are always happening on behalf of freeing Americans. And Austin Tice being held by one of the worst regimes in the world. Hopefully this sends a message that we want to bring our Americans home.
Let me ask a parallel issue here, Congressman. You've been quite vocal on the issue of the war in Ukraine. Any concern that a Vice President J.D. Vance, future President Trump, might reduce or seek to reduce the amount of American military support or the amount of American financial aid for Ukraine?
Well, let's remember that it was President Trump and leadership who actually armed the Ukrainians and prepared them to push back against the Russian earliest incursions in Donbass back in the 2014 timeframe when he came into office. He had armed the Ukrainians, something that the Obama administration had not done. And also President Trump moved troops forward to Poland when he was president as a part of his NATO strategy. And we have NATO pulling in the same direction. So I don't think anyone in America, in any political party, wants Vladimir Putin to achieve victory in Ukraine. I don't think any American in any political party wants Ukraine to be subjugated by Russia and have their sovereign territory taken. So I think that's where Americans are. Yes, Europeans need to do absolutely their part as much as they can in ejecting Putin from Ukraine with money, humanitarian aid, and military might. But as an essential partner in NATO, America stands at the side of Europe in this fight.
Congressman French Hill here in Washington, where it might today be even hotter than back home in Arkansas. Thank you for your time. Have a good weekend.
Well, I can tell you it is. You bet. Good to be with you.
I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
Donald Trump is under fire for those remarks yesterday. What his campaign has to say about the heated interview at a conference for black journalists. You're streaming America Decides. You've likely seen some of Donald Trump's fiery exchanges at the National Association of Black Journalists conference on Wednesday. The former president is still not backing down from his remarks at the event. We bring in Janiyah Thomas now, who still is in Chicago. She's director of Black Media Affairs for the Trump campaign. Janiyah, we appreciate your time. I want to start off with a housekeeping matter. What was the cause of the delay at the event? It came up a few times. I was hoping you could iron out why it started late.
Yes, there was an audio issue going on. The microphone wasn't working. That was the initial start of the delay.
There was no issue of negotiations. It was purely technical?
Yes, it was surely technical.
All right, so wondering if this was the strategy from the jump, if the former president decided to, question the vice president's biracial identity at the National Association of Black Journalists conference in particular.
I mean, I think that the question was racially targeted, and I think he responded in a way that is along with the common sentiment of a lot of Black voters. If you get on social media or you look into YouTube, like a lot of Black voters are saying the same things that he said. You know, I said the issue mainly isn't whether she's Black or what her ethnicity is. The issue is the flip flopping. You know, it's convenient to be Black, and then when it's convenient for her, she's Black. When it's convenient for her, she's Indian. It's just the back and forth flip flopping and not being able to stand her ground on what her actual ethnicity is.
If I'm understanding the answer correctly, you're saying it was maybe organic based on the questioning and not something he walked into the ballroom itching to say?
Yes, no, I think it was definitely because of the question, the way the question was framed. And initially, they asked her about they asked him about her being a DEI hire. And Biden himself has basically called her that in some form, saying that he had the most diverse administration. And it starts at the top of the ticket with the vice president. And even before that, when he was choosing a vice president, he said, I'm putting a Black woman as my VP.
How was the reaction in the room when a former president is questioning biracial identity of somebody else? Was it received poorly in the room?
Whether people want to believe it or not, there was a lot of laughter in the room. I mean, a lot of the journalists found it funny because, like I said, if you dive into Black Twitter, that's what most people are saying right now and have been saying about her in the recent years, I was like, so everything he said wasn't crazy compared to the stuff people were saying on social media.
I don't know about most people, but let's put a pin in that. I want to talk about the reaction to it from other Republicans, other legislators. Let's take a listen to what Tom Tillis of one of those battleground states, North Carolina, had to say about the former president's comments. Take a listen.
I think anything that takes us away from the failure in the economy, the failure of the border, and the failure of national security, in my opinion, is a distraction.
If fellow Republicans in one of those battleground states says this is a distraction and the former president should move past it, do you think Donald Trump's going to move past this issue and turn the page on it?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you've seen his Truth Social post today, he has been posting about the policy issues around her being terrible at the border, being a border czar, her being soft on crime, her terrible economy that she's been a part of with Joe Biden. He's been posting about that on Truth Social all day. So I think, yes, of course, he's going to move past it and focus on the policy issues because at the end of the day, her race and gender have nothing to do with why she's a terrible candidate.
And a number of Republicans also wondering how this expands the tent. No longer in a base or primary election. It's a general election with particularly diverse battleground states. Who do you think he's welcoming in that wasn't already in his supportive tent to begin with?
I mean, I think the overall point or the main takeaway that we should take away from this event is at the end of the day, he showed up. And I think that says a lot to voters that he showed up knowing he was going into a hostile environment and was willing to fight and answer the hard questions. I think that he deserves enough credit for that. And I think that also, he was put into a situation where the initial question set the tone for the entire rest of the panel. So, I mean, that question made the entire thing about race. But I think at the end of the day, what Black journalists care about and what voters care about are sometimes not always the same thing, I think a lot of voters they did a disservice to voters by targeting him on the racial thing so much and not really getting a chance to really talk about the policy issues. And I think that was a disservice to voters because I think a lot of Black people want to hear about the tangible items of what he has done and what he can do for Black America.
Seems to be some agreement between the former president's supporters and his detractors that it was an illustrative event. Janiyah Thomas in Chicago, thank you very much. Both President Biden and former President Trump take victory laps for today's release of Americans hostages held in Russia. Our panel is going to weigh in next on the politics behind the prisoner swap. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Vice President Kamala Harris says she and President Biden engaged in, quote, complex negotiations to release 3 U.S. citizens and 1 U.S. resident from Russian custody today. A panel of guests are here to dig into this and the implications of it. Leanne Caldwell is co-author of Washington Post's Early Brief and an anchor for Washington Post Live, and Braxton Booker, national political correspondent for Politico. Leanne, I'll start with you in a moment, but first let's take a listen to more of what was said earlier today.
It's just unbelievable. It is unbelievable what we're letting happen at this southern border, and we're letting it happen because Kamala Harris refuses to do her job. What President Trump and I promise to the American people is very simple. This is not rocket science. It is not hard to secure the southern border. You just have to re-implement some common sense policies.
No, we're definitely in a presidential campaign because she's talking about foreign affairs of great magnitude, and at the same time she's getting domestic criticism from a would-be opponent. Let's start off, though, with the prisoner swap.
Yeah.
The vice president today said unequivocally it was a complex negotiation that she and President Biden were part of. What kind of political impact can this have in this unique presidential cycle?
I mean, this was fantastic for the Biden administration. And right now, everyone is saying the Biden-Harris administration, especially when something good happens. This was monumental for Joe Biden. There was a really incredible detail in the Wall Street Journal story today. Of course, Evan Gershkovich is a Wall Street Journal reporter who said that an hour before President Biden sent out his tweet saying that he was not going to run for re-election, that he was on the phone with Slovenia trying to secure this deal. So the fact is that he has taken this off the table. At his press conference today announcing this, reporters asked, what about what Donald Trump said, that he would be able to get these people home quicker? And President Biden responded saying, well, why didn't he do so when he was president? And so this is... President Biden is going to share the glory with Kamala Harris. He obviously wants her to win. And so this was a great moment for the administration. I'm not sure if it's going to have any sort of actual impact on voters, but they can't be criticized for it, which is always a good thing.
Let me flesh that out a little bit more. The politics are, of course, secondary on a day like today, but we're in a presidential cycle, so everything's politically relevant. I guess it matters, Brackton, if this is actually one of those elections in which foreign affairs move the meter.
Well, we are seeing that it is certainly in Republican circles going to be front and center when we're talking about the border, where we saw Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who is, of course, Trump's running mate, trying to basically tar and feather Kamala Harris for the handling of the Biden administration's border policy. But I think what you're seeing, too, is that Republicans, especially these two on the top of the ticket, seem to continually to step on their message, right? They do have a good message about, hey, Democrats should own this border crisis. But then when you talk about whether or not she's black, whether or not she's Indian, which one is it, and try to make her decide which one she is, I mean, it really muddies up the waters when they're trying to score some political points and try to get back some of the media attention that they had prior to Kamala Harris ascending to the top of the ticket.
If you have 2 or 3 different messages in a day, you don't really have a message. So on the issue of immigration, are you seeing early evidence the vice president is trying to proactively snuff that out? We've seen that in some special elections this year where Democrats have tried to win on battlegrounds in which they are viewed as weak.
Scott, do you know what I'm writing about for my newsletter tomorrow morning? Because you feel like you're my editor right now.
You gave that vibe to me.
So, yeah, absolutely. I spoke with Representative Tom Suozzi today, who won a special election in large part because he leaned into the issue on immigration. He is thrilled that Vice President Harris seems to be doing the same thing. At a rally in Atlanta on Tuesday night, she addressed the issue of border security. One of her first ads as a candidate, as the top of the ticket candidate, addressed immigration, saying that she is the one who is trying to solve the issue, while President Trump, is the one who's trying to sabotage the issue. And so she is trying to define the issue for herself before Donald Trump is able to do so.
We also know at the same time, in a broader sense, Democrats today in the Senate are trying to raise some attention to that Supreme Court immunity ruling, which came down 1 month ago today, the immunity for former President Trump in the January 6th case. They're going to get anywhere politically with that? They're not going to get anywhere legislatively with that.
Right.
Politically, is there a real upside to that?
Politically, I think you're going to see some of the folks on the far left of the party say, look, hey, if a president is immune, then go ahead and start talking about how you're going to structure the court. Maybe add a couple of more Supreme Court justices so that the announcement that Biden made earlier this week, having, Supreme Court justices have term limits, maybe you can start inching that policy into fruition if you can do some of that. But largely speaking, I don't know if this is going to be some of the be a topic that's going to rise to the top tier of the politics and the political debate, and especially heading into the Democratic Convention in a couple of weeks. But certainly, I think you're going to have some people continue to push this and say, like, hey, we cannot let Supreme Court reform fall by the wayside as we get closer to the election.
I just think that legislation that Senator Schumer introduced today is just a fascinating and kind of a novel way to address the immunity issue at the court, because the immunity issue from the Supreme Court was a constitutional question. So all other ideas have been trying to start the process to amend the Constitution. But Senator Schumer's legislation is saying, hey, let's legislate what the court can decide.
What
so
they get.
So it's a novel way to get around a very long, cumbersome process of amending the Constitution, even if the political and legislative avenues aren't there right now.
1 year ago today, at this moment, we were covering the indictment of Donald Trump, August 1st, 2023, on those charges. And a year later, here we are talking about changing the laws potentially over how you can prosecute a former president. Did time go fast or slow?
Both? It's both.
Yeah, exactly.
Leanne Caldwell, Braxton Booker, thank you both. Evan Gershkovich, his colleagues at the Wall Street Journal are celebrating his release tonight. Next, we speak with the paper's Moscow bureau chief for her reaction. You're streaming America Decides. Today's prisoner swap is the largest of its kind since the Cold War. The deal ends more than a year-long nightmare for Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. We bring in Ann Simmons, Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, who worked closely with Evan. And it must be a dizzying day, rather busy day, so thanks for making time for us. How does it feel knowing Evan's on his way home?
Oh, well, Scott, it's absolutely incredible. It's truly a momentous occasion. It's a relief for Evan, his family, and his family at the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal has worked and lobbied really hard in order to ensure that his story remained front and center and that this day would come, that he would be released. So most definitely everyone in our newsroom is just over the moon.
And through that process, you're juggling all these different things. You're advocating for him, you're reporting on this piece of history, and you're human. You're worried about him. Explain what it's been like getting through the past year for you and your colleagues.
Well, it's certainly been challenging. I should point out that I actually covered Evan's story as a journalist, so wasn't actually part of the team that was advocating for him. There was a whole campaign that the Wall Street Journal launched in order to make sure that Evan's name remained front and center, and that the Biden administration indeed kept working to ensure Evan's release. It's definitely been challenging. It's a story that's close to our hearts and on a personal level, certainly close to me. You know, I worked very closely with Evan. I was actually the person who hired him, chose him for the job. So it's really just so incredible today to know that after 16 long months of being imprisoned on a charge and convicted for a sham charge, that now he's released. It's definitely a relief.
For so many Americans, what they've seen of Evan is him in that inhumane glass box in court. They don't really know him as a reporter or as a person. Tell us what he's like as a reporter and as a person.
Evan is an incredible young man, really resilient, and I say that because he spent 23 hours every day in a small cell, just with 1 hour of exercise a day. As a reporter, he could really understand the subtle nuances of covering Russia, particularly because he is of Russian heritage. And he really brought that to stories. You could really tell that, you know, Evan understands Russia, loves the country, and really loved, and still, I'm sure, loves covering Russia, telling stories about ordinary people, telling stories about the history, and also trying to kind of unravel all of the intricacies that make up the regime of Vladimir Putin. And Evan was really and is just such an incredible reporter in terms of being so dynamic. He has kept his head up the whole time during this awful ordeal. And we're so pleased that he's now returning to our newsroom.
The president on his social media platform posted this image of Evan and the group on the plane with the U.S. flag draped behind them. It's a pretty powerful photo. No doubt you've seen that image and you've seen recent images of Evan. How different and in what way does he look different?
Well, certainly Evan also, had acknowledged that he has lost weight. He looks a little drawn and rather exhausted, which is, of course, natural. He's been in a Russian prison for 16 months. He was, he had to shave his head before he was transferred to Yekaterinburg for the beginning of the trial. So certainly that's a difference. His hair is certainly growing back already. And so I think there will be a period where Evan inevitably will need a long time just to rest and recuperate and digest the experience that he's gone through. But knowing Evan, he's going to want to come straight back to work. He's, he's got that kind of dynamism. He really is quite energetic. And reporting is his love. And certainly we want to emphasize that is exactly what Evan was doing when he was detained last year in March. He was doing journalism.
How does this change the way you approach covering Russia and your team approaches covering Russia?
Covering Russia already has been extremely challenging and became even more so with the start of the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. It's certainly very difficult to get sources to talk on the record, Russian sources. You have to be very vigilant in terms of knowing that, your phone calls could be monitored. The people to whom you speak, you could actually be putting at risk because they're speaking to the foreign press. It really has caused a chilling effect in terms of a reporter just doing his job being picked up. That has certainly had an impact in terms of how reporters now go about their business. I know that some reporters employ self-censorship. That is not something the Wall Street Journal does. We have always, maintained that a war is a war, and we've called it that, despite the fact that the Kremlin wants to call the invasion of Ukraine a special military operation. But it is really treading a fine line and knowing how to navigate some of the pitfalls that you could confront when covering this really challenging story.
At a moment, it is uniquely important to be covering Russia. From the Wall Street Journal, joining us in London, Ann Simmons. Thank you.
Thank you.
As the Americans freed in a Russian prison swap head home, we take a look at the role Vice President Kamala Harris played in their release. You're streaming America Decides. We continue to follow the historic news of the prisoner exchange that has freed journalist Evan Gershkovich and U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. We bring in founding partner and Washington correspondent for Puck News, Julia Yoffe, who has reported extensively on U.S.-Russian relations. Julia, we're grateful for the time. What did you make of how this all has been playing out today?
Well, we heard rumblings earlier this week that a major prisoner exchange was in the offing, but officials here in the U.S. were tight-lipped. They obviously didn't want to jeopardize anything, and they wanted to make sure that this went off without a hitch. And what we did find out in the end was that it was an extraordinarily complex negotiation and operation. It involved 7 countries, over 24 people being swapped, and a tremendous number of diplomats working together to make this happen. It's quite a feat. It's the largest prisoner swap since the end of the Cold War.
When she spoke today in Texas, Vice President Harris used just that phrase. She said she and the president undertook a complex diplomatic negotiation. What do we know about the vice president's role in the negotiations?
Well, we don't know a lot yet, but the White House has been trying to make sure that they highlight her role. You can't forget that the Democratic National Convention is just around the corner. The election is right around the corner. And given that people in the kind of foreign policy, national security establishment of Washington see Kamala Harris as a bit of a blank slate, as somebody who comes more from the domestic policy side of things, connecting her to this would, of course, shore up her foreign policy, national security bona fides. What we're also seeing is that the White House is making sure to stress the strength of the alliances that made this happen. It's not just Germany or the U.S. releasing it's not just Germany and the U.S. releasing Russian prisoners, spies, et cetera, but Slovenia, Poland, Norway, Turkey was involved as the third country where they were exchanged. And the White House confirmed a report that Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, said that he would do this specifically for Joe Biden. He said, "I will do this for you." And it seems like a kind of rebuke to the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, who has talked about America first, about European allies being deadweights or deadbeats, and saying that he would let Russia have its way with them if they did not pay up. And so this is a kind of tacit rebuke saying this is why alliances matter, because when push comes to shove, our allies come through for us.
Sounds like you expect her to make some type of major foreign policy address at some point in the coming weeks or months.
I don't know about that. I did not say that.
No, fair enough. But it sounds like it's something that you think may need to be fleshed out or clarified, that she has this position on this matter involving foreign affairs.
Perhaps not. Perhaps in a general election, all you really need to do is draw a contrast with the person you're running against on the values level and the interest level. My opponent wants to do X, I want to do Y. My opponent believes B, I believe A. That may be enough. For a general election, Kamala Harris has not had, in the way that Barack Obama did, the way that Joe Biden did, and even Donald Trump this time around did, kind of advisors putting together policy papers that would give us a hint as to what she might undertake as president, who she would appoint to key roles as president. She has landed in this nominee role very recently. There's less than 100 days left to go until the election, so it's unlikely we'll see any of that. And I don't know that she'll even need it.
Yeah, and predicting where campaigns go is always a bit of a fool's errand for us. I think you handled that ably. Julia Ioffe, we appreciate your analysis and your reporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Unlawful migrant crossings along the U.S.-Mexico border have fallen to their lowest level since September 2020. Internal government figures obtained and first reported by CBS News show U.S. Border Patrol agents apprehended nearly 56,000 migrants along the border last month. That marks the fifth consecutive month of decline in apprehensions. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas also shared the latest deportation figures with our Camilo Montoya Galvez.
We have been able to return or remove a record number of people this past year, almost 875,000 individuals.
That does it for today. We're back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.